Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast, and good evening and good morning to those of you around the world. My name is Sarah White. I'm the Executive Director at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard. I'll be filling in for Dr. Barbara Beer today in giving introductions. She sends her regrets and her well wishes. She is traveling for work overseas and made the unanticipated decision to cut her work short yesterday and return home. So we wish her safe travels and her return back to Boston. Kristen, let's go to the next slide. So welcome everyone to the webinar. Before we move into the content of the work, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center. We are a research and policy center based at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. And our vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. Since 2009, we have engaged a diverse group of stakeholders, including industry, academia, government from around the world, nonprofit organizations, and patient advocates to understand, define, and look towards the emerging issues in global clinical trials and to create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. All of our work and our resources are openly available on our website. It's my pleasure to introduce Trevor Baker. Kristen, let's go to the next slide. It's my pleasure to introduce Trevor Baker, Program Manager here at the MRCT Center, who's been co-leading this work. And so, Trevor, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trevor Baker. I'm a program manager for the AI and ethical research portfolio here at the MRCT Center. I just want to thank you all for joining us. Today, I'm introducing the new framework for review of clinical research involving artificial intelligence developed over the past year by a task force of IRB professionals, ethicists, AI technologists. This was a collaborative effort to meet the growing need for practical tools to support IRBs and institutions in reviewing research involving AI. In this presentation, I'll briefly walk through the structure and the purpose of the framework, highlight some of the key tools it offers, and explain how it could be used in a real protocol review. This will also set the stage for our panelists, which will join us shortly, where you'll hear from our colleagues across different perspectives with a lightning talk from each one of them, and then a panel discussion for the remainder of today's webinar. Next slide, please. AI is increasingly embedded in clinical research, from imaging and diagnostics to behavioral interventions in digital therapeutics. But these technologies also raise questions that IRBs aren't always equipped to answer, such as, when is the AI tool part of the intervention? AI also raises ethical and regulatory questions around issues such as privacy, potential for amplifying bias, and maintaining human autonomy in research. Regulatory agencies like the FDA, HHS, and NIST have issued high-level guidance, but at the IRB level, gaps remain. And so that really brought us to the work that we're going to share today. Protocols could arrive with missing details, undefined data sources, or opaque algorithms, and that could lead to delays, inconsistencies during review, and just general uncertainty. Our goal was to build something practical, a framework to help IRBs apply familiar ethical and regulatory principles like those in the Belmont Report and the Common Rule to unfamiliar and evolving AI methods in clinical research. Next slide, please. So this framework was developed over the past year by a multi-stakeholder task force convened by the MRCT Center and our colleagues at WCG. Our members include representatives from academia, industry, IRBs, and AI technologists, and we grounded our work in real protocols under review and drew on the foundational guidance from the Common Rule, Belmont Report, SACARP, NIST, and others. Throughout, we prioritize usability. What does an IRB reviewer need in hand when facing a protocol involving AI? What are the sticking points? What's missing from current review processes? The result is a structured yet flexible tool that can be adapted and used in practice under the current regulatory guidelines. Next slide, please. So this framework is a tool to help IRBs apply existing standards in new contexts. It's rooted in the ethical principles of the Belmont Report, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, and the definitions and criteria outlined in the Common Rule. Its goal is to help IRBs interpret these principles in light of how AI systems work, especially when tools rely on massive data sets or are trained on de-identified data. And it applies existing definitions of research, human subjects, and minimal risk to studies involving AI, and encourages IRBs to act within their remit, even when AI is an unfamiliar topic. So our goal is that it complements, not replaces, current regulatory and institutional policies. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because we don't have time to go through any questions, but this is part A of the framework, initial questions to guide oversight. It's a logic tree, and it's a logic tree that helps determine whether a given study involving AI requires IRB review based on existing regulatory definitions of research and human subjects. I'll say a little bit more about the purpose of part A on the next slide. Next slide, please. So here's a closer look on the logic flow. It's a little bit simplified in the graphic on the left, but part A walks through scoping questions grounded entirely in current regulations. It doesn't ask reviewers to evaluate AI technically. It helps them decide whether oversight is required and why. The tool is designed for consistency across our institutions and reviewers, and it's structured in a way to document decisions at the boundary of what is research, what is operational uses of AI in the administration of research, and what about AI in QI, QA settings as well. In short, part A helps IRBs stay in scope, ask clear questions, and document how those decisions are made when first looking at a protocol or a clinical research protocol involving AI. Next slide, please. Moving forward, the next section in the framework is part B, which is review considerations by AI developmental stage. If oversight is required after going through the decision tree in part A, this section is really allowing reviewers to prompt questions about the context of how the AI system is being used and where it fits in the AI developmental lifecycle. So it maps AI activity in clinical research across 3 stages. And I would like to take a moment to thank our colleagues at the Mayo Clinic who provided these developmental stages. And you can check out their work via the link that'll be put in the chat. But the 3 stages are discovery, which is often even before an intended use in the AI is apparent. And that involves like sourcing and labeling data. And the next stage would be translation, which is the model training and validation steps, but not yet deployed in the clinical setting. And deployment is when an AI system in clinical research is put in a real world use in a study. So each stage comes with different risks, and the framework also includes cross-cutting issues like data sources and collection, the provenance of the data, algorithm stability, what happens over time with these algorithms and could that affect the results, and also the identifiability of data, and the risk for re-identification and privacy risks of participants. These cross-cutting topics may not fit into one of these 3: discovery, translation, deployment. It could fit into multiple, but the framework includes prompts and considerations for reviewers to consider for all of these topics on this slide. Next slide, please. And part C is identified ethical considerations. And it prompts IRBs to assess how AI aligns with established ethical principles on these topics of human agency and oversight, privacy, confidentiality, and data governance, technical robustness and safety, transparency, representation and fairness, and informed consent. These questions, within each of these considerations, there are prompting questions for reviewers to identify ethical issues that may not show up in the protocol. And this part of the framework sharpens, not replaces, traditional ethics review. Next slide, please. And the last part of the tool is part D, which is a checklist for AI tools that are not part of the invention, but may still impact participants via the administration of research. For example, systems that match participants to studies and recruitment, screen eligibility, or flag consent errors. Often these tools fall outside the IRB purview, but they can still impact participants, especially in how people are selected, screened, and contacted. Next slide, please. So with today's launch, the framework is publicly available on the MRCT Center's website, and I'm sure the link has been shared at least once in the chat today. So we encourage you all to go and check it out. It's designed for use by IRBs, researchers, sponsors, and institutions, really anyone involved in the clinical research protocol development, review, or oversight. The task force is still meeting, and we're also developing case examples to further illustrate how each part of this framework would apply to real protocols. Those will be published at a later date to complement this framework. And most importantly, this is a living resource. If your institution uses it or adapts it, we want to hear from you. What works, what needs refining, let us know. And the oversight landscape continues to evolve, and this tool is meant to evolve with it. Next slide, please. So with that, we'll now transition to our lightning talks and panel discussion. I'll take a moment to introduce our panelists today. They are all members of the task force, so we thank them for all of their efforts in putting this resource together, and we're really excited to hear from them today. Our panelists today are Mary Gray, Senior Principal Researcher at Microsoft Research, Kevin Nellis, Executive Director of Human Research Protections and Quality Assurance at SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University, Curry and McDonald, Medical Chair Director at WCG, and today's panel will be moderated by Donna Snyder, Executive Physician at WCG. Before we get to the panelist discussions, we're going to start with lightning talks from each of the panelists, and so I'll now turn it over to Kevin Nellis to begin our lightning talks. Thank you all.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. And before I start, I just want to wish everybody a happy Pride to whoever celebrates that. And the purpose of me today presenting is I'm going to be going over one of the case studies that will eventually be part of the framework document. If I could have the next slide. So this is a case study of a study that was submitted to our IRB at Downstate, and it involved a wearable electroencephalogram that included a machine language learning tool. And the goal is to support women with alcohol use disorder in managing overeating. And this is a pilot study. So the goal was to enroll both healthy individuals and women with alcohol use disorder, and they were recruited in our Flatbush area. Our downstate IRB determined that the initial recruitment in just the Flatbush area was too narrow, so we encouraged the investigators to expand it broadly over all of New York City, and that's what they did. The study is a pilot study, and the goal is to get real-time feedback using the AI tool to give feedback to, initially, this first pilot program is only collecting data that's being shared with the PI, the principal investigator in the study team. It's not actually giving feedback to the participants, to control their eating behavior. This is just a pilot study. And why this matters is that this is an investigational device. It's using AI, and the goal is to eventually create a behavioral intervention to help women with alcohol use disorders in controlling their overeating. It's not yet developed into that. Next slide, please. So I'm looking at the framework. Of course, we didn't have this framework available, and I'm so glad it is now available for IRBs. This study is actually in the discovery and translation phase, and as you look at the framework, you can sort of see how the IRB should review things based on the phase that they're in. Of course, the IRB still needs to make the regular determinations. They determined it was an FDA-regulated medical device, and it was a non-significant risk device study. And the IRB was actually very careful to make sure that none of the protected health information that was collected during the study was actually uploaded into the AI tool or the portable devices. And they were also very careful to ensure that the informed consent disclosed the future use of the data and how the algorithm was designed to work so that the participants would understand how their data might be used to develop behavioral intervention in the future. The IRB was very concerned with bias and participant equity, so they did ensure that the local population was expanded to the broader New York City area, and they wanted to make sure that there was equity in the recruitment so that the study could be scalable in the future. Some of the ethical concerns around the AI was the IRB wanted to ensure that there was no tech halo or horns effect. And basically, you didn't want to we didn't want the investigator or the participants to think that that the AI was like the magic bullet, for example. It wasn't something that was guaranteed to work, for example. And we also wanted to ensure that that the investigator understood and the IRB understood and the subjects understood the horns effect, of the study, that there's no fears in the use of the AI. And as far as the informed consent was concerned, we wanted to clearly explain the role of the AI and the limitations of the AI. And the IRB also wanted to ensure that the investigators had the appropriate expertise in order to carry out the study. And I'll end with that. And go on to the next speaker.
Hi, I'm Korean. Nice to meet you. So Kevin briefly introduced this concept of AI exceptionalism, a belief around AI's capability compared to a human. And I see this as an unresolved tension in clinical research involving AI, and I appreciate a few of your minutes talking to you about that. One side of AI exceptionalism is the idea that AI bests or beats humans without question. Flip is that AI is inherently flawed and unknowable, pointed out this horns and devil, this angel and demon effect. I'd like these next few minutes to discuss AI painted as transformative and fundamentally novel and dangerous and deceptive because of it. No matter what your view, point I'll touch on at the end, AI research requires careful consideration within that context, and the MRCT framework can help. First, it is important to recognize that AI is not a singular entity. We must approach AI in research with the understanding that its transformative potential depends on certain facts. One of which is that the research involved exists in a rapidly advancing societal use of AI. This advance is largely without research and oversight as we know it. Of course, its development may or may not have needed or need oversight or even research as we might define, although it might be completely acceptable to be as it is. Nevertheless, at some point, what was once novel becomes standard. We all must elevate our baseline knowledge and ensure our expertise is keeping pace as we review this research. Research involving AI should take into consideration and specifically communicate where the research begins and ends, including the procedures and the risks and human involvement. What exists regardless of the research, what is the research impact, and so on. These aspects always were and remain crucial, whether or not AI is part of a study. They just become of focus when it is. The notion that AI's ever-advancing learning is required and inherently positive or negative is also not necessarily true. AI systems can be locked or described adequately for both researchers and reviewers to communicate effectively about their use. Communicating and understanding the AI's intended use, its deployment, its algorithmic stability and transparency, and the boundaries of the AI, as well as the boundaries of the AI's impact, are all essential in this process. That it is a computer, AI is technically data-driven and thus can be very accurate or have inherent biases, just like all uses of data. The AI's training data source and review, its performance metrics, and standards proposed by researchers also need to be clear and measurable. While the AI's impact on humanity, overall, whether beneficial or detrimental, is often debated, humans are at the core of our research. Careful consideration of AI's impact on human participants in the research and the intended generalizable knowledge is needed. Is this AI research potentially going to advance humanity? Is it just a fishing expedition or a 3-hour cruise? Even if it will replace humans doesn't tell us if it's good or not. Similarly, we need to consider the specifics of human involvement in replacing and executing the research. Where and how human oversight occurs. Where, how, and when the human in the loop is doing. That's the point, not just that there is a human in the loop. The translational capabilities of AI, which can make complex data much more accessible, is one of the core aspects of many AI. This can elevate communication potential and raise concerns about privacy and confidentiality. It is vital to clearly define what is private, confidential, and how to protect sensitive information in research, as well as how and what data enters and exits. These concerns are not exceptional in research, of course, and their consideration here need not invoke exceptional measures. The The MRCT framework can help guide our thinking along this well-worn path, as well as the others I referenced in this new context. 4. At the end of the day, taming AI exceptionalism requires our acknowledging our own responses to uncertainty. Do we optimist, realist, or pessimist, ensuring that our biases do not unduly influence research? And with that, I'll hand it over to Mary.
Hi, Mary, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that. My name is Mary Gray. I'm a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, but also the chair of our ethics program, which includes a federally registered IRB. And I want to offer you some thoughts on my experiences for over a decade, seeing the trajectory of the area of research that develops artificial intelligence within computer science and engineering. I want to offer this notion of the paradox of artificial intelligence last mile. It comes from my own research looking at just how much human tending goes into developing training data that ultimately becomes the models and applications that we call artificial intelligence. And as the previous speakers have noted, in the simplest terms, artificial intelligence is a software program, a very sophisticated and powerful one, but it is always going to be driven by data. Even if we develop models that can be severed from the earlier training that they did on data, as we want to evolve AI models, particularly in scientific inquiry, it will always be important to have an awareness of and indeed more connection to the sites that generate data. So with that in mind, and drawing on this notion of how much automated decision-making systems are based on humans' prior decision-making, I want to point to this tension that the promise of these AI systems to automate and scale scientific discovery and inquiry will continue to call on the need for human judgment. And we'll probably have a bumpy road of figuring out when and how often to have humans remain in the loop of identifying the contextual understanding and indeed the ethical oversight of the development of these systems, of these models and applications. In clinical research, this paradox is going to become especially acute. The closer AI gets to influencing care decisions, the more essential it becomes to ensure that the data that it draws on, that it's using to develop a model of decision making is traceable, interpretable, and ethically sourced. And I want to spend some time thinking about this question of sourcing data for developing AI. The framework rightly emphasizes transparency and accountability, but we're going to need to expand our understanding of data provenance beyond technical metadata, a list of the prior consent in a broad sense, and particularly the idea that the data has been de-identified. That evidence of de-identification is a fairly brittle and arguably fairly time-bound promise to anyone who's contributed data because it is so easy now to re-identify anyone who's been interacting with digital systems. So data provenance beyond technical traceability, the framework rightly emphasizes that this transparency is going to be necessary, but we can think about how the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, drafted in the aftermath of the horrors of forced scientific experimentation in Nazi Germany, and then the passing of our own National Research Act in 1974 in the United States, tells us that scientific communities that are learning from people and people's data have already agreed to a fundamental approach to maintaining the public's trust in science, in the integrity of the scientific enterprise itself, to account for where our data come from when we're making scientific claims. So now more than ever, seeing AI in science can only improve if it evaluates the trustworthiness of AI's core ingredients, the training data. That means that sound AI research must include the social and institutional histories of data sets by being able to answer or at least acknowledge when we don't know answers to questions like who contributed the data, who collected the data, under what conditions, and with what assumptions. This is not just a technical issue. It is an ethical one. Without this context, we risk reifying the biases that our previous speaker spoke to, but also the very likely risk of misapplying models in ways that are going to undermine the public's trust and the safety of these models, because we're going to make assumptions about the universal generalizability of the models we have. Ongoing consent, making it a living process, could be a way that addresses some of the risks that we're heading toward. The framework's attention to consent is commendable. I would argue we need to push even harder for models of ongoing consent, especially for AI systems that evolve over time and are repurposed. Consent shouldn't be a one-time checkbox. Participants should have visibility into how their data are used and the ability to withdraw or renegotiate the terms of using data about them in models as the uses change. This is particularly important in longitudinal studies or when AI tools are deployed in real-world clinical settings where data reuse is fairly common today. So I'd argue that institutional readiness is going to hinge on building reflexive capacity. The framework provides a solid foundation for IRB readiness, but we also need to build reflexive capacity within our institutions, mechanisms for revisiting decisions, updating ethical assessments, and engaging with affected communities themselves. No more, this is about everyone. Being able to identify in the training data who is represented and representable is the beginning of thinking about the impact of the models that we develop. This is an excellent opportunity to see the value of drawing on existing social, behavioral, and education research practices that have always had to consider, and in fact heed, the rights of research participants to decide when, how, and what degree they're involved in scientific explorations, and in all cases that they ultimately hold the right to withdraw their contributions and to refrain from being part of science. Lastly, building institutional readiness will need to include training reviewers to recognize when AI systems introduce new ethical terrain. When we're changing the questions we're asking, we're changing the methodologies we use, or training who we imagine we're hoping to impact with our science. Equipping researchers to ask the right questions, to have the right tools as questions, won't be just about fairness and accuracy. It'll be about the power and accountability and the social impact of our science. Let me close with what I hope is a hopeful set of encouragement as someone who has had the privilege of watching the cutting edge of AI research from inside an industry-based lab that set the bar for attention to the impact of computing. You have kindred spirits in computer science and engineering. Most of these research communities want to see the importance of the work that they do also attending to the training data that's gone into building their models. They don't exactly know how to do that, and they've often looked for and are continuously reaching out to the interdisciplinary scholars in the social sciences and biomedicine that are going to be part of a critical interdisciplinary team connecting with communities, providing data for us all to learn in the future with this powerful tool we're currently calling AI. Thank you.
So if all of our panelists could come on camera now, thank you very much for those interesting and thoughtful presentations, all on different topics related to AI. So I like the diversity of topics here as well. I thought I'd start, well, first I want to mention that for those of you online, please enter any questions you might have into the question and answer section of the webinar. We'll try to address some of those. I already see some questions that are already there. But I wanted to open with a couple of questions, and it seems like we don't have the ability for the panelists to raise your hand. So if you want to say something, just jump in. But I wanted to see if anyone has any more comments about the idea of AI exceptionalism as it applies to research. And I also want to mention something that I read about this weekend about the end of human exceptionalism and how you think about that when you think about AI exceptionalism. So who would like to answer this question, or if any of you will. And so go ahead, Corinne.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take the first stab at that. The first is this understanding of the end of human exceptionalism. And I think Mary touched on it really well. In thinking of intelligence over time and as technology has come in, intelligence started, for example, just being able to do calculations in your head. Well, calculators made that no longer really feasible. And then there was the idea of just remembering a lot of things, and that obviously fell away. So it's no surprise to think that we have this next generation of tool that is going to help humans reevaluate what they consider as intelligent. I think a core human value, though, is that the human value is what's driving it. The tools and computers, as fancy as they get, will always be there to help us. So I think that will never end. Human exceptionalism just change its look again and again as we traverse across technology. The other piece for exceptionalism, I think, is I think AI exceptionalism will be pushing the boundaries of what we consider humanity, though. And I'm interested to see how we, as a now more global community than ever, start to appreciate humans ever more than before.
Go ahead, Mary.
If I can just add a thought to that, I love that, Corinne. I feel like for me as an anthropologist, what I'm looking for is how do we start accounting for our social interactions, that we're more than the sum of our parts. I'd say most of scientific inquiry has been fairly focused on individuals as both subjects, participants, and when we think about the modeling that currently exists, we're making assumptions that a prior decision of me purchasing my shoes in a particular time or place is somehow applicable to people like me. I think there's a lot of work we can do to see that our individual decision making doesn't always tell us what is the most important part of the puzzle. It's what are we socially trying to achieve? How are we interacting? We haven't begun to bring that into the modeling that we're doing today. And that's, I think we could be less individualist and more social in the way we think about how are we going to use these tools for exploring our collective decision making for any of the questions that we're asking in science.
So in the question and answer section, someone asked, but won't AI surpass our abilities at some point, even if it won't happen soon? Mary's shaking her head no.
Hard no for me.
Okay.
And can I fill it out with, I think that the hardest part is we've learned so much about how varied intelligence is. There is not one way of thinking about our ability to do computation quickly as the only form of intelligence. We've learned about emotional intelligence. We've learned about so many different ways in which we sense the world. And I'll share with you my favorite quote from a computational theorist, mathematician Madhusudan, who'd said one of the hardest things to encode in computation are the senses, because we learn how to sense each other and the world throughout our lifetime. And we could still argue we have lots of different ways we sense the world. That's really dense communication that you can't pack into code. So there's so many ways to know and understand the world. I'm sad that we think so little of how much we have to learn and how little AI really reflects what we know.
And just to go back on that, I also appreciate, as I've modeled the language and the tools as advancing, that AI could never possibly replace humans because there's something intrinsically human about a human, and that a machine can never do that. There's enough science fiction that supports otherwise, but that is not reality as we happen to know it. So appreciate that as well.
And I can add, I really love playing with AI, but you also learn that it lies to you. So you have to always realize that there always needs to be some sort of human oversight in the output of the data that's generated. So the human element will always be critical in this process.
So Kevin, on that note, did you want to comment any more about the tech halo effect or the horns effect?
I mean, this is something that I've recently just learned about in preparation for this talk. And the halo bias or halo effect is, I guess, the cognitive bias where one always believes and trusts in AI without really supporting evidence. And then the horns effect is basically the opposite. And I like Kieran's description of it, either the halo or the devil, or the horns, or the angel or the devil. So the horn effect is the opposite of the halo bias. So it's a negative trait. So if you had a bad experience with AI, you might just think, oh, AI is never going to be any good. So you have to sort of be aware of those biases. And when you're reviewing research, you have to be aware of those biases as well. And maybe the investigator might have a halo bias when they submit a protocol, and maybe it's overwhelmingly positive without really focusing on other biases or limitations of the project. So just be aware of that, as you review the projects. And I think sometimes it's also important to make sure that the subjects who are being recruited into a study understand that AI might not be the best thing for them. For example, if they're interacting with a chatbot, they shouldn't automatically assume that the chatbot is telling them everything that's truthful and honest, but they should be aware of the limitations of the AI chatbot, just as an example.
So Mary, I have a question for you. In your presentation, you mentioned the removal of data as AI algorithms are being developed. I had thought that might be somewhat difficult, particularly, I know we talk about the de-identification aspect and how that may not even exist anymore, but it sounds like that still could be difficult. So I was wondering how that might be managed.
I think we're at the very beginning of being able to rethink what is going to constitute privacy and security of data in the AI age. And that is really, for me, the most urgent public educational movement we need within our disciplines, within the scientific community, is to talk honestly about the brittleness of de-identification so that we can move to a place where we're saying what are going to be the new mechanisms for ongoing engagement. If I think of it less as a matter of consent and privacy preserving efforts, those are certainly important, but that those are necessary, not sufficient to the scientific enterprise, that I'm really looking for a way to meaningfully engage people in contributing to scientific inquiry. I think it opens up entirely new approaches to how we manage the data that we collect. Collecting more and more of it and not having a sound approach to how we respect the rights of people to say what happens next isn't the solution in my mind. I think the good news is we've literally never really tried it in computer science and engineering. So we have these fantastic, pretty sophisticated privacy approaches that the assumption has been nobody really cares that much about their privacy, so why bother? If we start caring, and particularly as scientists say, we're the ones that should be responsible for stewarding the appropriate use of people's data, I think we could move towards some really interesting approaches to that. Very hard question.
So I'm going to go to another question that's, I think, really a practical one about the use of, or the identification of devices within an AI protocol. So it says phase 1 of the proposed framework is discovery ideation and suggests IRB GCP compliance. Does this mean you suggest evaluating whether the AI ML product meets the FDA definition of a medical device at this stage? Does anyone want to answer that question?
I mean, I could take a stab at that, but others may want to add to that. I think even in the discovery phase, when somebody is using what might meet the definition of a medical device under FDA, you have to really consider whether that AI software, the AI tool, meets the definition of a medical device. And there are carve-outs within the FDA on things that they are no longer considering medical devices, and we outline that within the framework. And if it does meet, if they are evaluating the safety or effectiveness of the tool, and it does meet the definition of a medical device, most likely it's going to be a non-significant risk medical device. But if it's not, then an IDE would be required. So definitely, I mean, every case is going to be different. So you have to the devil's always going to be in the details. So you have to look at the specifics of the protocol, and it might require some conversations with the investigator if that protocol isn't clear. Anybody else?
Corinne, it looks like you were answering another one. within the, which is great. So thank you. The next question is, our institution is developing a consent compendium to offer researchers to include text in the main consent documents that describes various AI tools and mechanisms. Any suggestions as we embark on this process?
I will say I popped in the chat a link to the data reflection questions that we use at Microsoft Research in our program. And we've refined those. They hopefully really resonate and might look familiar to folks who work with SBER projects. That thinking about a protocol as a place where you're raising you're kind of returning to the basics of Belmont and thinking about what kinds of practices are in place feels like a more effective approach than trying to approach AI in scientific inquiry as something from out of nowhere. So that would be my recommendation is having those kinds of questions, thinking early and often, and with awareness that the impact or the shape of the models and the applications that might come from it will constantly change in new application environments. So we hopefully are now entering this new phase of being accountable for not as individual researchers, but actually as research communities for what are the evolution of the kinds of AI instruments we're using, and it will be pretty context specific.
And I'll mention that when the people who are on this call have a chance to look at the framework, you'll see that there are tons of references in it. So the documents that you're talking about, Mary, as well as all the FDA guidances, FDA information on how to evaluate devices is within the document. So I'm hoping that people will be able to use those resources as well as just the outline that's in the document itself in terms of how to look at things step by step. So there's a question here for Kevin. It's the individual is asking, can you say more about the IRB determining whether the PI has appropriate AI expertise? How can individuals with no expertise in AI know what's appropriate?
Yeah, for this particular study, this was a new investigator to our institution, and we weren't aware of her experience. So we evaluated her CV, number one, but we also discovered that she was also developing more of these types of AI tools at a prior institution. So she had a wealth of experience, in the past with developing the algorithms and the tools that were going to be used for the study. So it was clear, to the IRB after we did some inquiries, that she did actually have this expertise.
There's a question here about the proposed framework in the discovery ideation section. Where or how does this phase align with the current FDA framework for the AI/ML product development cycle in terms of data selection and management, model training and tuning, and model validation? Anyone want to handle that question?
I can maybe kick us off. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
No, go ahead, Mary.
I was going to kick us off and say the hardest part is that much of the regulatory framework we have, when we get more specific about AI, unfortunately, it doesn't give us the room we're going to need to be constantly returning to the reflexivity that I was gesturing to, and really institutional considerations for what is it that you expect of researchers in the integrity of science on your, at your setting and what you hope to see in research communities. So I'd be wary of trying to tighten these frameworks to what exists in the current approach in the FDA, and be more interested in seeing how we use these frameworks to improve where we're going.
I'm going to echo that perhaps a little more simply. I see this in the MRCT framework as study specific, while the FDA is looking at a programmatic and project level. Similarly to the way a drug may go through, in FDA's lens, phase 1, 2, 3, and then get approved, there may be points at which it goes back and reopens another phase 1 study. This would be similar to the way that the IRB may see a discovery and ideation phase of a product or a research that is not anywhere on the FDA's track because it doesn't go through those kind of simple phasings. And we may see something that has gone back again. So I think the MRCT framework is a protocol by protocol view, while the FDA's is kind of longitudinal for a single product.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add, I just recently attended another conference where the FDA was talking about their guidances, and they said they purposely didn't include a lot of cases in their guidance because they know there's going to be so much variability, and they don't necessarily want, well, this is a spokesperson for the FDA. I won't say that the FDA actually said this, but that you know, they don't want people to become too rigid in the way that they think about this, because each protocol and each application of AI may be very different depending on the specific situation.
And that goes to the earlier point of good intentions of trying to provide researchers with help in defining what they're doing may be more harm than good if we try to box them in instead of having them tell us what they're exactly doing and then do our job of relaying that appropriately to people in consent information or ensuring that what has been proposed is appropriate.
So there's another follow-up question from Mary. Is it really realistic for IRBs to prevent or limit use of AI research, not because of anticipated current or future harms to human participants, the typical IRB focus, but because of possible past harms related to AI development? For example, using an AI tool previously trained on questionably sourced data sets like AP content or exploiting low-paid labor. Perhaps any such decisions would need to be coordinated across all institutions to have any real impact beyond limiting their own researchers.
It's a really important question, and I think one of the reasons that I personally got involved and professionally have put so much time into the research compliance communities is because I think this, you know, everyone on this call is in one of the strongest positions to establish the norms we want to see around scientific engagement with AI. And so knowing that, I think being able to turn to your institutional considerations and the power we have as professionals who have thought about what constitutes ethical scientific practice, to turn to us to be able to surface what are going to be the ways that researchers can, in practical senses, move their work forward in consultation with each other, knowing that there's so much about what's changing for science is how science is done as AI is introduced. Like, we're seeing really the transformation of the scientific enterprise, and it is a really good opportunity to rethink when interdisciplinarity is driving research questions, when you need the complementarity of different expertise on a research team, when you know that there are going to be downstream effects that, or questions about downstream effects for particular communities, particularly vulnerable communities that are otherwise not represented. This is the wheelhouse of the IRB professional world. That we're in a good position to be able to inform, not necessarily with a sense that we're going to stop or mitigate every possible bad harm. That can't be the goal. The aim is how do we create the cultural norms and the expectations in research communities that we proceed with these principles that assume the right of individuals and more broadly, I would say, society, groups within society, to see the benefits and to reap the benefits of science. And being able to go back to some basics is the opportunity for every protocol. If it wasn't done well somewhere else, every researcher gets a chance to improve what's happened and to move us forward. And I really do believe that this community is going to be fundamental to what that can look like for the future of science, because I don't see a future of science that doesn't involve this new software. If we just call it software, think of it in those terms. So that's a long-winded way of saying we can't catch what went wrong before. We can absolutely be part of making things better in the future.
Yeah, to touch on that, I think the question proposes no current or future harms just because of a past harm is, I think, a bit incorrect. So just for example, a AI tool trained on a questionably sourced data set will have future harms because it is not solid It's not based on a solid foundation. So it is perfectly within the researcher review team to say your data set is not adequate to go forward with it as it is. And as Mary was pointing out, all the other things that can follow from that.
So do any of you have any suggestions with an IRBs looking at a protocol, how they decide when they need to re-review the protocol?
Depends on the protocol.
Or
no, tongue in cheek aside,
in the group.
I think starting with, as we laid out first, recognizing your own biases, appreciating that where your own expertise is, and also having a good tool like perhaps the MRCT to walk you through what exactly to think about. You know how to think about these things, and just a little bit of help will get you there.
And how do you see the IRB using this tool? You know, a lot of IRBs are used to checklists that they go through, whereas this is a different type of document. How would you recommend that your IRBs use this tool?
Right. So one of the uses we're seeing here is consent forms. So, I mean, this is, I think, one of the challenges is that this software that we're calling AI can do several different things, most of them not that well without a lot of human oversight, like any software program. And so it would be useful to separate out, like, are you applying it in your program to be able to more quickly generate forms that are drafts for your researchers? Like that's a perfectly fine use of a large language model using AI to be able to generate templates. It's really good at anything that's repeating a genre. It's also, as Kevin warned, built to be a mansplainer, or that's my language. Like it's built to sound like it knows what it's saying. And so to approach it as it's going to be good material to spark reflection. I think, Corinne, you made this point in your talk as well. That is as soon as you get more comfortable using it in your own administrative processes, you're going to quickly see where it falls short. And the most important thing I'm interested in is everybody understanding every time you're using it, know the terms under which you're using it. Is what kind of license do you have for that software tool? Did it guarantee that whatever you're putting into that prompt box is staying at your institution? Those are the critical questions we should be asking right now as we experiment with the tool. But that's a separate use than using it in scientific inquiry. And we shouldn't treat it as the same thing or conflate AI for, drafting practice consent forms compared to using it to interview people, which I think is a terrible use of AI. I'll just say that out loud.
I just want to add, as you look at the framework, when you first look at it, it's going to be very new to you. But if you could review the framework in the context of reviewing a protocol that's been received by the IRB and kind of go through that framework, I think it will really stimulate a lot of questions that you may not know the answer to, and you'll have to go back to the investigator to get those answers before you're willing to approve the study. So I think it's a very good tool because it will stimulate, conversation and learning, because we're all learning about what AI is and how you can use it in the research setting.
Yeah, I think that includes the researchers. So using that tool to walk us through together, understanding what the one person is trying to do will help the overall research community, as Mary said, support the public trust in science and scientific inquiry.
Thank you all for contributing to the webinar today. I think it was an excellent discussion, and we're expecting this to be a dynamic document. So, what you see today, we hope to modify over time to, meet changes as the just the whole environment changes based on AI. We know things will change in our opinion. Some of these things will change over time. I think we got to most of the questions. Looks like Mary's answering the last one that's in there, which I appreciate. So, so I think we can close the webinar. I want to thank very much again our panelists for joining today, MRCT Center for all of the incredible work they've done on this, particularly Barbara Beer, who's not able to join us today, and Trevor Baker, who's done the lion's share of heavy lifting on getting this document ready. And we anticipate that we'll have some more communications out about this, as well as some cases, example cases to share with everyone in the future, and maybe even some other things as we think about this even more. So I'll go ahead and close the webinar. And again, thank everybody for their participation. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everybody. Happy Pride.